Back in the 1980s and 90s, Japanese subculture was a force to be reckoned with. Japanese manga, anime, and games were world-class. But now, in the eyes of a generation more accustomed to parasites, Squid Games, and the BTS world next door in South Korea, Japanese content as a whole seems to have lost momentum. It's understandable, because some people don't bother watching anything from Japan. This topic is a history of subcultures, with a focus on Japanese manga and anime. Most scholars believe that the history of Japanese subcultures began more than 100 years ago, in 1920, when the subculture began to industrialize. This 100-year history is a fascinating story in itself, but it's also a cautionary tale to avoid making the same mistakes the Japanese did. To summarize from sociologists like David Lisman and Howard Becker, a subculture is a set of values and culture created by people who, for one reason or another, have not been accepted by mainstream culture. The opposite of subculture is main culture or high culture, which refers to the general culture of classical art, classical literature, and so on. And high culture refers to the culture of the upper classes of the past, such as classical music and classic paintings. It's important to note that subcultures and other cultures are not hierarchical. A subculture is a new culture that is a reaction against the existing culture, and the rebels are bound to be a minority in the early days when they are powerless. So they will be oppressed by the vested interests of the high or main culture. But there is a moment when a subculture breaks out of this cycle. That's when it becomes mainstream. In a capitalist society, subcultures become mainstream the moment they prove they have the money. Manga and anime are special among them. Although they have grown into a culture enjoyed by people in their 40s and 50s, they are still heavily influenced by the purchasing power of children and teenagers around the world. This is because the culture itself was born out of the consumer culture of teenagers. In other words, the reason why Japanese subcultures dominated the world and the reason why they fell out of favor can be traced back to teenagers. The subculture can be traced back to activity photography. It began in 1896 and was first shown to the general public in 1911. The main audience for Japanese activity photography was teenagers who didn't enjoy kabuki. From this point on, the subculture developed a tradition of relying on the curiosity and contagiousness of teenagers. But the kids' heyday didn't last long. By the 1920s, the market for activity photography had become saturated, and companies began investing in the artwork and cultivating quality. They bring in people to narrate the story or bands to play the music. As production costs went up, prices went up, and kids didn't have pocket money back then, so they told their parents what they wanted to do and got paid for it. Anything that the consumer thinks twice about will not sell. The subculture market was driven by the purchasing power of teenagers, but there is a tradition that as the market grows, the purchasing power of teenagers weakens, and this causes a crisis. So, Japanese businesses start importing activity photos. It was much cheaper to import than to make it yourself. At the center of this, of course, were the works of Disney Studios, which was founded in 1929. This is when the Japanese subculture was revitalized. The Great Depression of 1929 led to higher import prices and fewer foreign works being imported, while the Manchurian Incident of 1931 and the Sino-Japanese War of 1937 led other countries to look to Japan for support. In particular, the United States bans the export of war resources such as scrap metal and oil. In 1941, Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, and naturally, the import of action photos is also banned. Ironically, with the disappearance of competitively priced and quality products, original Japanese products begin to be made. About a decade later, in 1956. After winning the war, the United States sought to militarize Japan into a dairy country to ensure that it would never attack the United States again. But in 1950, in response to the backlash of the Korean War, the United States built munitions factories in Japan to prevent communism from spreading southward, and the investment led to a revitalization of the Japanese economy and industrial system. With economic development comes many changes in Japan. The first is pocket money. As the economy grows and society becomes more affluent, children have pocket money. In addition, Japan was transitioning to an industrial society and nuclear families began to form, so relatives would give pocket money every holiday. From then on, pocket money became a right for children to live like a person, and from this point on, teenagers became consumers of their own volition. Second, genres changed. The genre that was popular in Japan before and after the war was war comics about war heroes. Fewer children and more adults were watching these movies because they were nostalgic for Japan's glory days. However, from 1960 onward, with the high economic growth period, the style of the works began to change. Artists such as Shigeru Mizuki created works that denounced the foolishness of war, while the next generation began to resent the adults who didn't stop it. Hayao Miyazaki and Yoshiyuki Tomino of Gundam are the creators who represent that generation. Their constant call for reversal was born out of their disappointment in the older generation for letting the war happen. Third, censorship. After the war, Japan's censorship system was tightened. In order for subcultures to make money in a bad economy, they had to be stimulating. Content became increasingly sexualized and violent, but in most homes, parents were out of the house working, so children were indiscriminately exposed to sex and violence. Cartoonists initially rebelled against censorship, but soon became quieter, not because they were afraid of the government, but because of the money. At the time, Japan was transitioning to an industrialized society and exporting heavily, and cheap but fully functional Japanese goods were popular around the world. But manga and anime were not popular. They were too violent and sensationalized to sell overseas. Furthermore, the mainstream of Japanese comics at the time were war comics, which often justified Japan's imperialism, so they couldn't be sold in the United States. As these circumstances continued to play out, Japanese subcultures became out of step with global trends. Beginning in 1960, the Japanese subculture market grew out of control, and division of labor began to increase productivity. In the manga world, it was triggered by Weekly Shonen magazine reaching 1 million copies. Up until that point, manga was created by a writer alone, but then editors and writers began to team up, with the writer drawing the characters and an assistant drawing the backgrounds. Naturally, with multiple people working on a comic, productivity goes up. And to make the product profitable, the manga is animated. But there was a dilemma in the animation market. As of 1961, a Disney 30-minute animated feature cost about 200,000 yen to import, while a Japanese-produced animation would cost at least 4 times as much. Of course, importing was fine, but in the winds of industrialization, the Japanese government pushed for localization and broadcasters demanded that a 30-minute episode cost 500,000 yen. Although the labor costs for animators were not high, it was still impossible to make them for half the price. Osamu Tezuka was the first person to start his own company, even though it was in the red. While he is often credited with helping to drastically reduce the cost of animation production, he is also credited with the growth of the manga industry and the rise of Japanese animation production. He was able to do this because television was becoming widely available to Japan's 100 million people at the time. One of the triggers was the 1964 Tokyo Olympics. He also created character merchandise and used the profits to cover his losses and got sponsors to spread the risk. In 1963, Iron Man Atom aired, and Meiji Confectionery became the exclusive sponsor, and their chocolate became a huge hit thanks to the Atom stickers. Later, Ezaki Glico became the sponsor of Tetsujin 28, and their success started a sponsor craze in Japan. Sponsors became more organized in the winds of industrialization. In 1974, Bandai, the sponsor of the space battleship Yamato, received a large number of postcards in the mail. The message was that Yamato shouldn't have wheels or a spinner. In the 1960s, toys were geared toward kids, so they would put wheels on them to make them roll. But Yamato's fans didn't want this. The reason for this is revealed in Mobile Suit Gundam, which came out in 1979. It didn't get a reaction at first, but then the toys sold well, and they made a movie version of the anime, which was a huge hit. That's when you can see the market shift. Clover, who had invested in Gundam, decided to make their own toys for kids and leased the rights to make the plastic models to Bandai. Bandai's sales were too good. Bandai's plastic models resonated with military enthusiasts. The success of Yamato and Gundam was proof that the default display for adults had emerged as a market. It was proof that adults who grew up with subcultures had a place in the industrialized marketplace. In February 1981, the declaration of the new century of anime was held in Shinjuku. The media thought it was just a bunch of young people watching kids' cartoons, but the young people gathered here proved that anime wasn't just for kids. Subcultures can go mainstream anytime they prove they have a large enough audience and can make money. Just like the Beatles and Queen, once subcultures are now mainstream in the music market. Then, by the mid-1980s, Japan's economy was booming, and so were its subcultures. Manga, anime, games, publishing, broadcasting, and more. But again, subcultures are driven by the purchasing power of teenagers, and many companies knew this, and so did the government. Japanese sociologists tell us that Japan was a country with a weak high culture and almost no popular culture. This focus on industrialization led to a negative perception of Japan as a country that only liked money. It wasn't until Japan's subcultures reached out to the rest of the world that this stereotype was shattered. Culture shapes a country's image. Japan's subcultures grew alongside its economy and were incorporated into mainstream culture, and as they spread around the world, they contributed significantly to the country's brand. Then, in the 2010, it came to a halt, along with otaku culture. So what happened to the Japanese subculture? Subcultures spread their wings when they encounter sponsors in industrial society with the power of capital, and it becomes more organized. Whereas in the 1960s, they were just investing in the 1980s with Yamato and Gundam. They start making money by selling merchandise that utilizes their art, and customers were excited about that. That's when we saw the first Macross and Nintendo's Famicom. Nintendo, in particular, was proof that kids had the purchasing power to shake up the market. Since then, Japanese subcultures have become highly industrialized and divisive, pouring out products to a wide customer base. They felt confident that they could sell in the marketplace. Surprisingly, Japanese works would not make it to the United States for about a decade. Having failed in the huge North American market, Japanese subcultures naturally focus on the domestic market, losing their global character in the process. At the time, this wasn't a big deal because Japan was growing rapidly. In the 1980s, Japan had a low interest rate monetary policy for several reasons. The ability to borrow and spend money at cheap interest rates led to a surge in stock and real estate prices and an influx of money that was optimistic about the growth of the Japanese economy. However, in 1991, the Japanese government implemented tighter real estate regulations, which led to a recession and a rise in non-performing loans. The famous bubble burst. The bubble caused Japanese companies to invest large sums of money in real estate and art, which were quick money rather than research and development. Assets grew, but products began to lose competitiveness and companies collapsed. The shock of the economic crisis began to sweep across Japan. While it's one thing to export when your domestic market is at risk, many companies have stopped research and development for years and don't invest in products that could revolutionize the world. They only took advantage of the stable Japanese market and made products that didn't meet the standards of the global market, so they were overtaken by South Korea and China in the global market. This is where Japanese subcultures came to the fore. The result of creativity made at a low price was competitive in the world, both in terms of content and price. Works by Toei, Sunrise, Studio Ghibli, and others began to reach overseas markets in the 90s, giving rise to the term Japanimation. However, the Japanese subculture industry had a weakness. Japanese subcultures that were powerful enough to change national brands slowly falter over time. There are several reasons for this. First, the industrial base began to crumble. Japanese producers continued to slash production costs even after Osamu Tezuka's death, and studios were making up for their losses by selling video software and character merchandise. The result was a perverse system where you can't live without airing on platforms like Netflix, promoting your product, and earning extra income. To make up for the losses, Japanese companies initially subcontracted drawing and sketching to South Korea and Taiwan. While the subculture market was rich, creators worked in a low-paying and unstable employment system. First, they weren't paid what they were worth and were forced to provide labor by the industrial system. Second, the purchasing power of teenagers has been eroded. It's often said that Japanese office workers bought luxury goods and cars during the bubble economy, but that's not true. Japan was one of the most affluent countries in Asia, but most of them were struggling to pay their high mortgages. When the bubble burst and companies went bankrupt, the Japanese government enacted a part-time labor law in 1993 to save businesses, and companies increased the proportion of temporary and contract workers. In addition, companies begin to move production offshore to reduce manufacturing costs and labor. In 2003, the Koizumi government encourages restructuring to reduce corporate debt. As these factors converge, the Japanese middle class slowly collapses. Subcultures thrive because of the extra money. But as children's pocket money shrinks for these reasons, and as marriages and births decline, the subculture market, which relies on teenagers, loses diversity. And the largest segment, the Tankai generation, continues to dominate the subculture market. The shock of subculture was not a problem that companies and consumers could solve. To survive, companies begin to focus on the few. The most typical example is the production committee system. It was introduced by Kadokawa Bookstore, a publishing media group, in 1991. The idea is that multiple investors form a committee, split the investment, and receive a proportional share of the profits. The problem was that the distributors and broadcasters got 90% of the profits, while the actual producers got only 10%. When Neon Genesis Evangelion became a global phenomenon in 1995, investment in the subculture took off, and by the 2000s, there was a clear separation between the companies that invested money in the work and the companies that organized it and made it a reality. Without a production committee with funding, it became impossible to make a work. Japanese production companies are investing less in new works, reusing existing works, and focusing on related merchandise for additional income. The customer base also slowly changed. When the purchasing power of the market weakens, a wide variety of goods are not supplied to the market. As teenagers' purchasing power wanes, subculture markets find new customers. First, adult-oriented products are developed in earnest. Then, as sales of adult-oriented products skyrocket, the market is recognized as a great alternative. And then, the teens move out. Comics for adults start appearing in magazines for teens. Evangelion, a huge success for the production committee, ditched the teens and went after the young adults who had the most money to spend. In addition to this, we can see that works like Gaogai, which targeted adults, had poor TV ratings, but sales of related products, such as video software, were quite large. In order to maximize revenue from young people, Kadokawa created a system that allowed them to make a lot of money with a small investment by designing a single product, such as manga, anime, characters, and novels. Many subcultures are created to be sold in the mainstream market. But if it doesn't make it into the mainstream market and only a few people enjoy it, the price goes up to cover the production costs. Lego developed adult products and raised the price significantly, and Bandai also reduced the number of low-end products and raised the price, and now there are products in the 200,000 yen range. As the number of customers decreases, the price of the product increases, and the number of people who enjoy the product decreases. With less diversity in the market, there's less chance of success, so the same products keep coming out. As the birth rate drops significantly, There are fewer products for teens. With a shrinking customer base and less diversity, Japanese subcultures are starting to lose the popularity they once had. This isn't just a Japanese problem. All over the world, subcultures are facing an aging population. Fictional worlds are created from the real world, and digging into fictional worlds reveals truths about the real world. For a subculture market to grow, you shouldn't just invest in what makes money. You should also develop products for future customers. But companies that focus on sales only invest in what makes money. This is true everywhere in the world, not just in Japan. But Japan's situation stands out because it was once a world-shaking powerhouse and has missed golden opportunities due to multiple economic crises. Japanese subculture is still great, but it's slowly sinking. If you liked the video, please subscribe and like it. Thank you for watching.